Okay, we're all set. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New School. My name is David Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School, and welcome to this conference, which is marking the 20th anniversary of the Vera List Center. I'd like to start out by thanking our organizers, the conference organizers and supporters, especially Francis Beatty and Alan Adler. Their generous support for this celebration. We had a little celebration last night as well, and today's conference is very important to this. Very important to this conference. I'd also like to thank all of the members of the Vera List Center's advisory committee, and of course, finally, we have to be most grateful to Vera List for her vision. Her legacy and that of her husband, Albert, has had a lasting impact on the intellectual, artistic, and physical landscape of not only the New School, but also New York City and the wider world. The Vera List Center was founded in 1992. It is the only university-based center exclusively committed to the intersection of art and politics. In that regard, I think it reflects the core principles of the New School, which are innovation and risk-taking, whether it's in the academic realm, the artistic, or the political realm, and social engagement, advancing the public debate, and exploring the role of art and artists as catalysts for social justice. It provides a forum and support for some of the world's most provocative and groundbreaking visual and performing artists, such as those we have with us here today. The New School is deeply connected and committed to the Vera List Center, and we feel it fulfills an important mission that is wonderfully synchronized with the New School's heart and soul. So it's an honor to celebrate this legacy and look forward to this center's future, another at least 20 years going on, I hope. I'd like to introduce and thank Carin Kuoni, who is our director of the Vera List Center for the past 9 years. She is the creative force behind the center's activities, playing the role of curator, programming director, fundraiser, coordinator, promoter, and even bottle washer, I think. So she is someone who reaches beyond the university to connect with the community, which is, again, the role of the center, and is very important, and engage in the broader dialogues at the intersection of art and politics. I know you're going to have rich and rewarding discussions today, and now I will turn it over to Carin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's really wonderful to have you at the helm of this institution, and I feel tremendous change has happened in the last 2 years, and more is ahead of us. I want to thank you all for coming early in the morning to hear this day-long conference entitled From Sustaining Democracy to the State of the Civic, 20 Years of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. I won't take much of your time. We were talking about it, that my remarks tend to be in really small font, and it gives me the illusion that they're really short, so I'll try to keep it brief. Rarely have I spoken here when I've been so acutely aware that neither my voice nor my words are mine alone, but are evidence of rich, diverse, and contentious history. The history of the people who spoke here before me, the institutional knowledge contained in these walls, one of the original modernist buildings in New York City, also original and signature building for the New School, the legislative developments in the city and in the country, trends in the art world, or trends in geology. I'm humbled by it as well as invigorated that milestones in social and political development, often enough commented on and complemented by programs at the Vera List Center, were initiated by some of these individuals going through the Vera List Center. A pioneer when we began, we now find ourselves in the midst of a groundswell of frenetic applause for socially and politically engaged art. The center is still a unique place and occupies a unique place with a mission that is more important than ever: to foster art that speaks to the world in a most critical, provocative, and challenging way, and propels our understanding of the political, the space where we meet as people. To wholeheartedly support artists who are using their work and creativity to help address pressing issues in society. To be a place of deep learning and help integrate artists' work in educational projects in lasting and extended ways, and to do so for and with a public. looking over the archives of the center, which is small, nimble, embedded in a large urban university with a storied legacy of progressive politics, lifelong learning, commitment to being in the world, certain topics emerge, core issues that surface again and again. In close to 500 events and 20 fellowship projects, 1 book, numerous occasional papers, several exhibitions, some lasting 1 day, and some 4 months, and now a new biennial international prize for art and politics, the following topics arise. One is art and activism, another one is identity politics, the aesthetics of the political, and representation in general. All of these, in various ways, are asking for definitions of the civic and are informed and facilitated by notions of aesthetic practices. The title of the conference, in fact, quotes one of the very first programs here at the center, which was generated before the center began or started in 1988 and was entitled Sustaining Democracy. And so we've conceived of today's conference as a 4-part call and response scenario, called on by developments in the world as well as cues from the archive. We're today offering responses which are really meant as replies, not answers, and are themselves often articulated as further calls and further questions. This morning, the first panel is entitled Art and Activism, from 10:15 or 10:20 to 11:45. At 12, we have another 1.5-hour panel on identity politics. During lunch, from 1:30 to 2:30, there is a performance by artist Rina Katz, and the title begins gradually. Title starts with the word gradually and with no small struggle, and is lifted from transcriptions from the archive of the Vera Center. And I encourage you to find the performance. It takes place in various spaces here at the university. At 2:30, we reconvene for the political aesthetic. At 4:15 for the People's Panel, Pickled Bohemia Redux, which deals with representations, and in fact came out of an online vote where we asked people, visitors to our archive and to our website, to vote for the panel they would most like to revisit. Speaking of and in voices, I do want to acknowledge and express my deep gratitude to some of the most influential and important voices in the Vera Center history. Mind you, they were not necessarily the loudest. Foremost, and David, you already mentioned it, Vera List, whose exemplary philanthropy spawned 6 art centers at 5 universities. I'd like to thank my predecessor, Sondra Farganis, who was the founding director of the Vera Center and ran it from 1992 to 2004, and whose reflections will conclude the program today. She can't be with us, so I'll be reading them. I'd like to thank my dean, David Scobey, Executive Dean of the New School for Public Engagement. I'd like to thank my chair, James Keith Brown, chair of the Advisory Committee of the Vera Center, and his most supportive colleagues on that committee, among them Ken Grossinger, Liz Hildman, Jane Lombard, and Joshua Mack. The leadership of the New School, I mentioned it before, is instrumental in allowing us to do what we love to do, and much credit belongs to David, to Tim Marshall, the provost of the New School, and deans across the divisions. I'd like to mention Joel Towers at Parsons as well. Sunny Kim and Jordan Bloom in the Development Department are very, very important partners. Pamela Tillis, Director of Public Programs, Brian Case and Mark Fitzpatrick in the AV Department. I'd like to acknowledge at the Vera Center itself, Naomi Miller, who is the Executive Assistant and joined us a few months ago, Johanna Taylor, who is the Strategic Development Associate, and Chelsea Haynes, the Curatorial Associate for this big conference and other programs coming out of it. I'd like to thank Walid Raad, the first fellow appointed here when I got here, and the exceptional fellows before him and afterwards. And they are named in our brochure and in the flyer. And some of them will be speaking today. Lastly, I'd like to point out that we've just given each one of you an artwork by Paul Ramirez Jonas. It's this name sign, which comes in different tenses. You have the choice of selecting any persona from the present, future, or past, and committing or enacting or incorporating this person as you join us in this public forum. There's also a limited edition print portfolio available that was published for the anniversary of the Vera List Center, and it's available outside. At 5:30, we'll have a festive reception with champagne in the, of course, Vera List courtyard. So I hope you stay with us for as much as you can and come back for that. We're moving now into the first panel, and I'll be offering very brief introductory comments about each panel and really introducing the speakers so that the discussion amongst them can immediately take off. First one is called Call and Response, Art and Activism. As I mentioned a while back, questions about contemporary art and its relationship to political issues centered on questions of propaganda. Could art still be art if it advanced a specific viewpoint? Could it be art if it only existed in the public realm, only as a public pronouncement? I think Hans Hacke and many after him have shown us how media language can be used in other than assertive ways, in subversive and many other ways. For the first discussion today, I'm very pleased to have among us some of the people closest to us by virtue of their history or institutional affiliations, and I'll introduce them very briefly. David Scobey, I'll go by the way there. See, David Scobey, right here, is the executive dean at the New School for Public Engagement and the person I turn to perhaps most consistently for guidance and encouragement. An American studies scholar, he is the author of Empire City, the Making and Meaning of the New York City Landscape, and other studies on 19th century America. From 1989 to 2005, he was professor of architecture at the University of Michigan, and from 2005 to 2010, Harvard Professor of Community Partnerships at Bates College, where he was also founding director of Bates Harvard Center for Community Partnerships. He's on the National Advisory Board of Project Pericles and the former chair of the National Advisory Board of Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. The next speaker is Wendy Ewald, who has for 40 years collaborated on international photography projects with children, families, women, and teachers in many different countries. Starting as documentary investigations of places and communities, Ewald's projects probe questions of identity and cultural differences. Ewald has received many honors, including a MacArthur Fellowship and grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Fulbright Commission, and the Guggenheim Fellowship just last year. She is a Vera List Center Fellow and was appointed in 2000 and spoke here repeatedly on the notion of the artist as educator and collaborative art practices. Then in the center, we have Nato Thompson, who is a member of the advisory committee of the Vera List Center. He joined Creative Time in 2007, is its chief curator, and has organized major projects such as the Creative Time Summit in 2009, 10, and 11, the exhibition Living as Form, 2011, Trevor Paglen's The Last Pictures, Paul Ramirez Jonas' Key to the City of New York, Jeremy Deller's It Is What It Is, and Paul Chan's Waiting for Godot in New Orleans. Previously, he was curator at Mas Mocha, where he completed numerous large-scale exhibitions, including The Interventionists, Art in the Social Sphere, an exhibition with a catalogue that was co-edited by Greg Cholette, who will be one of the speakers on the last panel today. In 2005, Nato received the Art Journal Award for Distinguished Writing. His book, Seeing Power, Socially Engaged Art in the Age of Culture Production, is forthcoming from Melville House. Then we have Andrea Geyer, who is an assistant professor of new genres at Parsons. Her image and text-based works are translations of specific social and political situations that address larger concepts, such as national identity, gender, and class in the context of the ongoing readjustment of cultural meanings and social memories. Recent works include Comrades of Time, a series of video vignettes in which young women embody texts originating in the Weimar Republic. And another recent piece is Criminal Case 40/61 Reverb, a 6-channel video engaging the history trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1961. Andrea was also a Vera Center Fellow in 2006, 2007, and during her fellowship year collaborated with Sharon Hayes, Ashley Hunt, Katja Sander, and David Thorne on a project called 9 Scripts from a Nation at War that was subsequently acquired by MoMA and was presented there until recently. Geyer also curated 2 exhibitions for the Vera Center and contributed to the Vera Center's first book, Considering Forgiveness. Robert Sember, on the very right, is a contributor to our second book, forthcoming in early 2014, entitled Speculation. Robert is an artist, a member of the faculty at Lang College, and a member of the international sound art collective Ultra Red. Just as the Vera Center got on its way in 1992, Ultra Red began, I believe, on the West Coast, and has since, in perhaps one of the most sustained artistic collaborations spanning 2 decades, investigated the contribution experimental sound can make to political organizing with projects that focus on concerns related to migrants' rights or immigrants' rights, affordable housing, sexual and gender rights, and anti-racism and anti-poverty struggles. Robert is a co-founder of the Albert Santana Ballroom Archive and Oral History Project, which is an element of Vogology, a long-term collaboration between Ultra Red and the ballroom scene that was initiated during Robert's fellowship here at the Vera Center in 2009. And this concludes my introductory comments, and now hastily hand over the microphone to Nato, and thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Carin. Okay, good, this works. Thank you for waking up, audience. We're going to get going. We're going to launch this first panel on art and activism. Art and activism, it's interesting, just to say, put it out there. I was thinking that there's another panel called the political aesthetic, which we're not on. So we could also talk about why we're not dealing with the political aesthetic, but in fact art and activism, which I like as a kind of provocation. I'm supposed to just introduce, just the format, I'm going to introduce the kind of questions, and then our diverse panel here, whose practices I think are emblematic of a vast ecology of aesthetic practices that take on a kind of political agency, are here, which is great, because in many ways I think what's important about the question of art and activism is that there's not only it's not that there's a singular approach, but what's important, I think if anything, activism puts on a kind of consideration of urgency to be a little more specific in your language of what's going on, of what's happening, to take seriously the affect and effects of the work you do. And that's, I think to not think about activism is just to kind of be lazy, which is fine. Or not fine, actually. Okay, so the question is, and then everyone's going to kind of present a little spiel response, and then we're going to just have a conversation, right? That's how we're going to do it. And we're going to do that for about an hour, and then we're going to do this kind of city council thing where you guys kind of come up and ask questions there. Okay. So the question being, how does an interest or commitment to social change or politics or activism affect your creative process and production? That is to say, how do you kind of incorporate this question of activism into your actual cultural work? And thinking about that too, of course, the things that we can consider are audience, context of reception, how one deals with aesthetics in a kind of strategizing of reception. So these kind of questions. So I guess I'll turn it over. How are we doing this? Are you going first, David? Is that the deal?
I think I should go definitely not first because I'm the outlier, not the...
Okay, we'll keep the outlier outlying. Who do we have first? Oh, right, it's not, these are just going to kind of scroll behind us, so it's not like a presentation. These set a mood for us. Makes sense. So, Andrea, you want to kick us off? No. Okay, well, I'm going to just give it to you.
Hello. I want to to just briefly thank Carin and the Panelist Center. It's been an incredible pleasure and honor to be part of the Panelist Center for the last 8 years in many different versions. So thank you, Carin, for your commitment and always getting us here early and being involved. Thank you. You gave us a question that I did not print out that we were supposed to respond to, which was around challenges and that we encounter in our practice and how we engage. What is it? It was well. So Nato asked us, in terms of your own creative practice, what are the aesthetic and pragmatic hurdles that you consider when trying to make your own work meaningful, thus perhaps political? So I thought it's a very interesting question, and I was trying to think around hurdles. There are many, they're none and they're many somehow. And the one that I maybe picked for myself that I think is interesting to discuss, I'm gonna use Hannah Arendt to kind of start us out in a way of thinking that might be helpful then to pull it towards an art practice. This is a little excerpt of her book, The Promise of Politics. And I'm going to just read two very short sections. So this is a section entitled Prejudice Against Politics and What in Fact Politics is Today. Any talk of politics in our time has to begin with those prejudices that all of us who aren't professional politicians have against politics. Our shared prejudices are themselves political in the broadest sense. They do not originate in the arrogance of the educated, are not the result of the cynicism of those who have seen too much and understood too little. Because prejudices crop up in our own thinking, we cannot ignore them. And since they refer to undeniably realities and faithfully reflect our current situation precisely in its political aspects, we cannot silence them with arguments. These prejudices, however, are not judgments. They indicate that we have stumbled into a situation in which we do not know, or do not yet know, how to function in just such political terms. The danger is that politics may vanish entirely from the world. Our prejudices invade our thoughts. They throw the baby out with the bathwater, confuse politics with what would put an end to politics, and present that very catastrophe as if it were inherent in the nature of things and thus inevitable. And I'm going to jump forward a little bit to the chapter Prejudice and Judgment. The prejudices we share as we take off the prejudices we share that we take to be self-evident, that we can toss out in conversations without any lengthy explanations are, as already noted, themselves political in the broadest sense of the word. That is, something that constitutes an integral part of those human affairs that are the context in which we go about our daily lives. The prejudices play such a large role in daily life and therefore in politics is not something that should be bemoaned as such, or for that matter attempted to be changed. Man cannot live without prejudices, and not only because no human being's intelligence or insight would suffice to form an original judgment about everything on which she is asked to pass judgment in the course of her life, but also because such a total lack of prejudice would require a superhuman alertness. That is why in all times and places it is the task of politics to shed light upon and dispel prejudice, which is not to say that it is its task is to train people to be unprejudiced, or that those who work towards such enlightenment are themselves free of prejudice. The degree of alertness and open-mindedness in a given epoch determines its general physiognomy and the level of its political life. But an epoch in which people could not fall back on and trust their prejudices when judging and deciding about major areas of their life is inconceivable. So I thought I'd bring that because when I think about what I struggle with in my work, as an artist, as a teacher, and as an activist, I think is to work against certain kind of patterns of recognition that people bring towards artwork, towards my work, towards other people's work, towards what they recognize as being political and the things they don't recognize as being political, the things that we consider relevant to be taken up. Also, of course, things that come in fashion that suddenly we pay attention. I mean, I'm saying like a New York centric art world like pays attention to certain aspects of communities that are otherwise considered at its margin. I mean, the recent interest in work of artists from the Middle East is one very interesting example, but there are waves of these kind of attention spans that happen that are not bad, but sometimes are not self-reflexive about the reasons why they pay attention to certain things, and also the fact that in the same time they're paying attention to one thing, they don't pay attention to others. So I'm interested in kind of breaking open in my work. I mean, this was just a side note on the art world part. I'm really more interested in my own practice how I can create work that creates a space where we can pay attention and recognize things that very deliberate systems usually make us not to pay attention to them because they're difficult, because they're issues of marginalized communities or marginalized concerns or concerns that are too potent, so they need to be contained. So it's all these ways of structures, of prejudices, as Arendt points us to, that we always need and will always have, but that we're not aware of, that I'm interested in working with and working through in my work.
I'm going to try and resist the seduction to make any sort of grand claims about art and politics, but let me attempt to lay out just a couple of the problematics that I think are at the center of the work that Ultra Red does, that I believe are productive places for us to be thinking through in relation to these issues, and certainly I think are resonant with the kinds of investments that I know circulate through the Vera List Center. I want to sort of take Carin's prompt. Carin mentioned that the Vera List Center and Ultra Red are the same age. And in a certain sense to just provide a little bit of a glimpse of the origin story of Ultra Red, because in so many ways the work that we do continues in a way to drink from the well of that crisis that was the prompt for the formation of the Sound Art Collective that I'm a member of. So the crisis was the AIDS crisis. In our case, is the AIDS crisis still. And of course the connected crisis, which is referred to as the culture wars of that particular period, which have had such a defining shape on what was then the extraordinary dynamic of that phase of identity politics that arose out of that particular confluence of crises, and that we now are in a position of reflecting on with a great deal of critique and concern and anxiety about the various sort of cul-de-sacs that identity politics ended up in. But the particular process for the formation of Ultra Red was that there was a series of sound artists, kind of really ordinary, everyday musicians, people who were interested in sound, some who had musical training, some who were amateurs who were sort of interested in sound, with a particular and unique interest in house music, and who had formed for a period of time one of those sort of transient clubs in downtown Hollywood. That is the kind of thing that you do when you're in your early 20s. And we're also queer, and we're very involved with ACT UP and all of the the strategies of social movement. And for those of you who are familiar with ACT UP, you will know that a kind of cultural activism was central to ACT UP. It was, ACT UP emerges very much at the time where the post-structuralist critique of representation was particularly vital, and a great deal of the sort of strategies of media intervention were inspired by this critique. The sort of loosening of the sign into what one could call the field of ideology, or the power, the constantly dynamic formations of power that we refer to as ideology. So no notion of, in a certain sense, the avant-garde shock or rupture that would in fact be revolutionary or transformative, but that constant ongoing process of a kind of negotiation and investigation through representation of these complex fields of power that were organizing experience and structuring, amongst other things, identity in some way. The practice, another practice of that I think in a way is a deeply creative practice, and I think is illustrative in many ways of precisely what we are talking about today, is something called harm reduction. Harm reduction is sometimes referred to not as an intervention but an intravention. Harm reduction is a practice that arose in part from those constituencies who are most affected by the AIDS crisis. And particularly important were injecting drug users, people who injected drugs using hypodermic syringes, who had become sort of aware that there was something happening in their constituency that was a pathogen in some way, and connected to the notion that while it was going to be impossible immediately to cease drug use, there were certain practices that could be undertaken that would reduce the harm or reduce the risk. This was a direct contradiction to the prevailing public health and political positions that were taken on drug use. And in a certain sense, you saw a constituency coming together, observing what was occurring, looking at its own resources, its own capacity to organize. Because if you are an injecting drug user, I learned this through years of doing street outreach in New York City, if you are an injecting drug user, you need to know how to read the city. You need to know how to work collaboratively. You need to know how to formulate your resources into a way that's going to enable survival to take place. And so there was already this robust network, this capacity for an intervention. So a group of sound artists helped form the first needle exchange in downtown Hollywood. And that, in a way, is all that Ultra Red is about, is the formation of that kind of pedagogical collectivity in which you reflect on what, as a collective, you know, and how you might organize that around particular investments in a struggle. Let me just say one last thing to just sort of connect it perhaps to a larger issue. One of the crucial analyses of the AIDS crisis, of the cultural movement within the AIDS crisis, was a critique of the notion of the public, which is so easily used within so many spheres, including the art sphere. The notion that we make our work to be seen by the public. Within the AIDS crisis, the public was manifest within this question that came up very quickly in the first years, which was, is AIDS a problem for the general public? Or is it something that will be contained to, for those of you who have a memory of this, Haitians, injecting drug users, people who are gay, and various other sort of small populations. And that very question communicates a kind of ideological position, this notion that there is the public, and then those who are counter to the public, who are marginal to the public, who are ultimately a threat to the public. And so beginning to throw into crisis the notion of the public and to perhaps dissolve it into an understanding that there are multiple constituencies, at the very least multiple publics, with different literacies, different investments. We can call these class positions or class investments. And that the scene of reception within which operates as an artist is constituted of these multiple and often contested publics, which is when you mobilize a work of art, it is going to go into these publics, into these scenes of reception, is going to do work that no intentionality, that no amount of preparation is going to be able to resolve in its entirety. So being able to have a methodology to actually identify, to hear, in ultra-rates terms, the scene of reception as a pedagogical scene, as an investigative scene, in order to be able to say we need to attend to what the object does beyond its launch, as the primary mode or space of investigation, as harm reduction to in a certain sense, is something that's critically important to us. And I think is something, perhaps we can pick this up later, but is something to put in tension with the notion of collectivity. And I have a few things to say about collectivity, but maybe in a short while. But I'll leave it there.
Well, I had lots of great questions and things I wanted to talk about, and I lost it all, so we'll see what happens. But I thank you, Andrea, for bringing up prejudice, because that's, I think, such an important point. And also Robert about talking about the history, because it's not just that we've gotten to art and activism now, which a lot of my students, sort of think it's a modern movement. But I started working with when I was 18 in a Native American community in Canada. And it was pretty clear that that there was no way that I should be photographing as a photographer in that situation. And that's sort of one of the first hurdles, maybe, that I got to realize that. And so fortunately, I was able to get cameras and film from Polaroid, which people did those things in those days. I was one of many people. That summer, I began to understand that what the children could actually, the pictures they could make weren't pictures I'd ever seen, compositionally or representationally of American Indian communities. It was before Wounded Knee and before any sort of recognition. Anyway, this is just to say that I went on from there, and now I mentioned earlier, I'm still working in that community. I saw the problems then, but didn't really understand them. I was 18. The problems now have, over 2 generations, have impacted everyone, and so the pictures have a new meaning. The pictures that were made then, there are pictures being made now. So I guess for me now, as I get older, it's more interesting for me to see what's happened over time. What's happened with those things you put out there or conversations you had. The slides that are up there are in Margate, England, and it's a installation that I did with a community and a school system. And one of the things that I found from the school system was that 50% of the students turned over every year. So 50% of the school population was new every year. And this was a community historically of refugees from World War I to now. But not only was it about a community of refugees from overseas, Europe in World War I or Africa now, but it is a community that has what they call new starts, people who are fleeing domestic violence, bullying, other kinds of trauma from other parts of England. So I wanted to work with them to make something that would sort of identify this population, which the local people were often very dismissive of, or even sometimes abusive, because it's a town that was a seaside resort, and these refugees remind them of how far they've come down. And but I knew that if I had just worked with international refugees, that would again be marginalizing that community, and I needed to put it in a different context. So working on the idea of childhood trauma about moving and journeys was the way that I decided to frame it. Eventually, we put an installation on the seaside where there were portraits that were looking out to the sea and then looking back into the land, and it moved from the sea farther and farther in time over like 2 years. And so at that point, the big hurdle was, okay, what do we, how are people going to react to this? What are we going to do about that? Because I knew it was provocative to do that. And unfortunately, or fortunately, well, unfortunately, the London bus bombing was during our installation. So we had to figure out whether we're going to go ahead, and we decided to go ahead with the event and had people guard the banners before the opening. But after the opening, about 3 days later, there was one installation of a Muslim girl, and her portraits were petrol bombed, and the National Front, which is the British fascist organization, had written graffiti all around them, and so it was very sad and upsetting for everybody. But what was amazing was that the family of this girl and the imam and the mosque all rallied behind the family, and they said definitely they wanted these things put back up. Not right at that moment, because it would give more publicity to the National Front. But I guess what I'm thinking about these hurdles or these obstacles is this: it's the real subject matter of the work. And whatever happens, that changes it, and the vision changes it constantly.
First of all, thanks to everyone for coming, and to Carin and the Vera List Center. We're really proud to be hosting this celebration. I didn't want to go first, Nato, because I feel like I'm a double outlier in this conversation in a useful way. First of all, I'm not an artist. I'm a cultural historian. I've been lucky enough to collaborate with artists like the poet Sekou Sandiata, the choreographer Liz Lerman, the textile artist Christina Beckstein, on a variety of projects, some at the University of Michigan, where I started a program called the Arts of Citizenship Program, and some in Maine at Bates College. And so I think I may be a cutaway for all the interlopers and outliers who are an essential part of this particular kind of art and culture making. But also in another sense, I think of the practice I've been lucky enough to be involved with as in a kind of dialogue about engaged art that I think Robert's and Wendy's stories have already started to stage. The projects I've worked most on have been less activist in an obvious sense, less immediate, urgently present responses to crises like the Ultra Red work, more about community and civic storytelling across communities of difference and inequality, maybe a little more resonant with the story that Wendy told, often involving contested issues and effaced or marginalized histories and communities. So I think about my larger project as a collaborator in this kind of art making as projects of democratic voice under difficult circumstances. And I guess I'd say three things about those projects. Just to flag, them in the slides I said. One of them is you'll see a picture of fabric hanging from a museum installation. This was a piece called Social Fabric that Christina Beckstein and I did in Maine, based on the oral histories of textile mill workers in deindustrialized Milltown, the town where Bates College is, Lewiston, which I turned into a text called A Small Piece of Woven Space Surrounded by the World, and she turned into that extraordinary 40-foot long hanging loom piece based on, created out of materials from the abandoned mills. This kind of project isn't about finding a community story, it's about constituting community stories, curating them, making them multimodally with multiple partners, in the very literal sense of the word, remembering them, making them a new body out of disparate materials through practices of gathering and transformation. So making, not finding, seems to me one of the really important pieces of this kind of engaged democratic storytelling. The second point I'd make is implicit in that unpacking of remembering, which is the significance of memory and social memory, or social remembering as a verb. And I've put up 2 slides of Shimon Ati's work, which for me really explore very deeply the role of social memory in engaged art making, precisely not as a commemoration of the past, but I would say as a way of activating the experience in the present moment of being an actor in history, which is to say, inheriting troubled pasts and transforming them into futures, in which the art gives you that experience of being a historical agent, including the act of arguing about past and future. And the final thing I'd say is that in this kind of historically embedded collective or collaborative storytelling, it's important to think of it as ongoing and open-ended and contested. And I've put up a slide of a poster of Sekou Sundiata's America Project, in which I was blessed to be one of many collaborators, not a slide of the performance itself of the piece 51st Stream State that he made, but a poster that was up in Lang College 2 weeks ago, bringing back people who had been involved in thinking about the implications of the work. In other words, the research and the gathering and the making and the performing and the producing of objects are all moments in the ongoing work of reimagining and re-engaging artistic meanings, in which the public and the next project are all implicated in a kind of historical chain of action. And it's through that, I would say, that storytelling becomes a way of convening, for lack of a better word, we the people in active publics.
Thanks, David. I'm just going to kind of throw some things around just to try to get us. So we're moving to a part where we're going to be chatting. What do you guys think about? Okay, so we live in an age where I think there's a lot of cultural production happening. It's going to be the hottest summer on record in the history of the world coming up, so get ready. We have this kind of situation where Obama feels like he's kind of letting people down. There's a lot of disillusion. We're coming out of a post-Occupy moment where something extremely exciting in this city arose, but just as maybe on the opposite end emotionally disappeared. And I want to say that because I feel like there's an urgency in activism to get something done. I guess that's one of the things that comes with the word. And so I'm wondering, and I'm thinking about the hurdles, the emotional and also practical hurdles of getting something done. And do you ever feel like, I think there's a kind of feeling that isn't just artistic, but civic, that we're not getting stuff done, right? That it's like, we're doing a lot. This is very, everyone in New York's busy. I think it's the thing everyone tells each other. Hey, what are you doing? Very busy. Hottest summer on record. Maybe you're not busy enough. Or maybe we gotta slow down. I don't know. I'm just saying there's a crisis about doing And so I'm just kind of throwing at you in terms of how that informs your own artistic practice. How do you deal with that mentally? How do you deal with that emotionally? Do you consider that? And how does that also deal with another part of activism we haven't talked about, but social movements? How do you connect to that? Does that matter?
I mean, I think you're going into something I'm really interested in, which is this kind of notion about doing that has a certain immediate outcome and a certain efficiency that I think the incredible advantage of art is that it doesn't need to do that the doing that happens in art is different, and I would like to talk about that a little bit. Nevertheless, I do think that a lot of artists and artworks share an urgency, and that they are urgent and they're really present, and sometimes not the works that one sees at the Creative Time Summit. You know, I'm interested in talking about the other kind of works. Like, can an artwork that is displayed in an institution that is not, you know, in using a little bit the kind of formula of going to a community, working with the community, doing something really in the community, having an outcome, what we see at the summit every year, like, but more works that maybe are not considered in that so much, and maybe there's an installation. How does urgency happen within within?
Well, let me just throw it at you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's have fun. So my only beef is, like, I have a beef with the Whitney Independent Study Program. So, like, I'm always like, oh, this kind of quiet, poetic, complex work that is totally nuanced in kind of theory and is totally has a reception in a kind of academic Marxist read. That's how I read it often, right? Like, I'm kind of like dismissive of a lot of that genre because I kind of think of it as like bourgeois Marxism, where I'm like, this is super for a kind of left that's out of touch. So how do we make a kind of work that's like, that doesn't do that, is what I'm asking. You know what I mean? Like, so
doesn't do what?
That is, in fact, legible, that produces a space, like to go to your Arendt thing, that is not necessarily, just to say, it's not in the kind of community-based stuff, per se, but at the same time is legible or produces a space of reception and confrontation and conflict that occurs. That produces a space of pedagogy.
But I guess what I throw, and I think it's not so helpful, like, for me to categorize in these schools, but what I'm more interested in really dealing with this kind of issue around urgency that demands a certain kind of, or creates a certain kind of impatience. Like, we need to see an outcome. We need something to have an impact right away. We need to, you know, this is how we recognize that something is a practice, because it's doing something, right? Didn't somebody write this article about how crazy it is to call everything practice, because practice is like practicing for something, you know, that we all call our work practice. But for me, there's how can we resist the impatience that we have to wanting immediate impact? Which is political work that I deeply am committed to and involved with, and I think it's interesting, Robert's work, I think, straddles both ends, right? It's like you're doing the work that is actually political, social, like a lot of people are doing things, and the Occupy movement is doing a lot of things still. It's just not so sexy and public, and so then it doesn't exist, but it does exist, you know, and a lot of things change, a lot of modes of organization have changed. And make impact, right? I mean, the Sandy stuff was, and you know, it's there. It can be activated. So I'm a little bit like, how can we resist this way of existing in which, through all the kind of modes of social media, busyness, this idea of an instant communication, there's this idea of speed that doesn't allow for, or it's not that it doesn't allow, it doesn't recognize a way of working that goes deeper and tries to think about the conditions how the conditions we're in are actually created, how they're operating, and how we can become aware of that. How can we organize with that across that, and so on.
Go first, Robert. Well, I want to second that. I really, and in the name of a couple ideas. One is I'm worried, not necessarily skeptical, but worried about the urgent privileging of the word urgent. I think sometimes it feels like it's exactly the right response, and I think for me the story of ACT UP and Ultra Red is a perfect example of where we need that kind of practice condensed in a present moment of response and intervention, which can be enormously creative. But I actually feel like we're often now in a moment where, and I feel this in my incredible annoyance with the idea of the pop-up phenomenon, the idea that we're responding to the speeding up and instantaneousness of social life, but by thinking that instantaneousness is the only mode of effective action. And it seems to me, if you look at a very different kind of engaged aesthetic practice, like the gathering of African American movement in the civil rights movement, where kind of years of curating and anthologizing and reworking, and that kind of iterative reworking produced new possibilities for intervention, kind of the opposite of strategies of pop-upness.
Can I just to clarify one little thing? Like for me, I want to be careful to not fall into a space of like arguing one thing against the other. But what I think is interesting for me is to figure out how we can use art and cultural practice as a space in which we can be immediate and instantly ready to go at the same time, where we're also able to create the space to do the other work. How do we do that at the same time? And that's, I think, really hard.
So I want to actually honor, in a way, Nato, the sort of spirit of your question, which is, I really do appreciate that some tough stuff is happening and we need to get on it. So I do think that there is something about urgency that actually is very meaningful, and that there is something to be addressed in that. And that I'm always, sort of bewildered by art's capacity to constantly delay, in a certain sense, the moment of transformation or change, right? So I want to acknowledge that. But I also, Andrea, I think what you're saying is incredibly important, that this sort of bifurcation of these things needs to be resisted. In Ultra Red, we have this little saying that we sometimes use, which is, in the face of crisis, slow down. Because if there is a kind of reaction, what's most likely going to occur is a reproduction of the very terms of that crisis, when in fact, in a certain sense, the analysis that's required in order to be able to shift the foundations that are producing that crisis are critical. And I think we learned a great deal from ACT UP around this kind of deep, insistent, iterative, constant process of analysis, in which the art sort of action or statement or address that was visible was just a small manifestation of the incredibly long and systematic collective arc of creativity that was, inextricable from the social movement as a whole. But I also just want to sort of reflect on something that's a deep formation for me. I was born and raised in South Africa. The urgency of apartheid was apparent and materialized every minute of every day. The struggle, however, was long. And for me, the question becomes, how do we actually sustain the long-term struggle? That, to me, is the question that I sit with a great deal, which is these pop-up phenomena can actually generate a great thrill. There's a deep release of emotion, and in a certain sense is responding to some of the profound desires for change and transformation that arise out of alienation, that arise out of a sense of a recognition of crisis and a profound feeling of hopelessness. And so you have these moments occurring that coalesce, and then the despair arises. And let me just introduce one sort of proposition which I've been sort of perseverating over, which is something that Zizek observes, and Carin, you'll know this from the piece that I've written for Speculation, in the final chapter of the book that he wrote about 2012, The Year of Dreaming Dangerously, which is in a certain sense, I think, a letter to us about our despair, in an attempt to try and say, how do we act in despair? Because it seems as though despair is so passive. But he makes this observation that we should think of the communist ideal as regulative rather than constitutive. that in a certain sense, the notion that art is going to construct the vision of the liberated future is really a ruse. You know, that utopian, that sort of capacity to manifest or represent the utopian future. And that the real question is, what can we do to contribute to being able to inspire and guide the actions that are made today that in some way are going to be a movement towards that, the constitution of that communist ideal in some way. And so for me, this is where we start getting into, the Occupy movement was extraordinarily productive, I think, in its practices, as have been so many movements. So that's the question I'd like to sort of just also introduce, is just what can we do through our work that in some ways contributes to sustaining the long struggle? Because something like climate change is not going to be resolved through the crisis in response to the crisis.
I agree with that. I just, just to say, it isn't necessarily just to kind of tease it out a little more, because I totally agree with this, and I know we're all kind of committed to these things, but I'm very interested. I'm not against, just to be fair, complex, nuanced, poetic art, just to say that. But I am very interested in spaces where these things are possible. And I think they're harder to find than we think, is what I mean to say. And I think also the rise of social art isn't just because it's a fad. I think because a lot of people feel an urgency, and there may be and so I'm also thinking about in your own experiences, do you have examples of places, like physical places or schools or institutions or communities where this kind of complex array of a longer term struggle, of a kind of nuanced parsing out of aesthetics and politics, but simultaneously the capacity to act urgently was all possible? Because I think examples are useful too.
Can I ask you just something I meant to ask you a long time, but that I always, I struggle with the idea of social practice, because it seems, I'm sure it was a very long process of getting to this term, as it seems to differentiate the social from the political, the cultural, and other things. And can you just, I don't know, in a nutshell, talk just a moment about what that choice to empower the term social did, for you, or does for you in the work that you're doing?
Well, just to be fair, I didn't come up with that term, and it's funny because it's actually comes from Suzanne Lacey, who isn't exactly new to the game per se, and it's interesting too to think of social it's very telling that it came from Suzanne Lacey, who, in many ways, who I think is such an amazing artist, who really studied under Caprow, and I think took this kind of happenings logic and gave it a political twist, if you will. So to think of that term coming out of that, I think is very interesting. You know what I mean? I didn't invent that. Frankly, the whole social practice thing is a West Coast phenomenon that Suzanne Lacey and folks were kind of doing, and there was relational aesthetics. We could do a kind of, I don't know, is it fun for you guys to do this? The map of the terms. And, I just said the word socially engaged art, but it's only you can't try to come up with really bland terms that don't become genres, because at the end we're just dealing with art and politics, right? Or art and activism, or the Vera Center's kind of mandate in a general sense, I suppose. So I'm avoiding your question.
Well, I'd like to talk about something a little bit different, but also sustained over time, is that I'm much more interested in working with individual people and moving on from that. And also that some of the practices I do are then become models for other people. Not that I necessarily try to do that, but so that's a way that things I think can get out there, but that's very slow. But I think about Apple Shop, which is this group that I've worked with for 10 years, and they started in 1969. And I did a lot of work in photography then. There was a radio station, there's a TV show, there's a theater company, and that has sustained until now. And but it's not that people are out there doing a project they do sometimes about strip mining, but then there are other things about old folk tales and supporting the culture. But what happens, I think, is that people do get tired, and that things do change, and maybe are, you know, they're different than we were when we were 20. And it's harder to get sometimes to get young people to join, or they don't stay. And you know, it just seems to be a different kind of time. But the Apple Shop was one of 12 centers that was created out of the war on poverty, which is interesting to think about. And they were all started in minority communities with the idea that it would give people jobs, but it would also change the demographics of Hollywood, which seems so ludicrously naive now. But so I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because like Apple Shop is still doing amazing work, and I just think about that too in terms of the long term, which is like institutions versus artists. Artists have to do projects. I mean, not they don't have to, but it's typically the way it's thought of is artists do artworks. Institutions have a mission. You know what I mean? I mean, like this, like no one says like, it's just a different way of thinking about the mandate, if you will, or longevity. I'm just thinking about that too.
Or authorship.
I was also thinking about, in answer to your question about spaces, Apple Shop and the Highlander Center, and what's happening in Detroit, which is seeing an incredible cultural renaissance out of the disastrous shambles of what's happened with the economy and formal politics there. And I think it would be interesting, and I would be eager to hear all of my fellow panelists' view, to think about the differences in context between rich cities where there is a vibrant art scene and you can make a living making and teaching art, which are also centers for certain kinds of movements, versus community contexts like Appalachia or Apple Shop and Highlander or Detroit, in which the ongoing recruitment of new generations of culture makers and intergenerationality of culture makers comes because of an embeddedness in a community that's urgently, constantly in crisis, and so people are constantly turning to forms of meaning making in response to that. Those feel like two very different contexts for answers to the question that Nato raised.
I'm sorry you guys have to eye each other about the microphone.
I'd love to collaborate now. I'm thinking about that. What you were just saying that kind of sidetracked me from my other thought, because I was thinking about Wu Zhang's project Wildness and his and the clinic that was associated with the project. It looks at a community of transgender immigrants in Los Angeles and their legal challenges, the health issues, legal stuff, and the community that comes together in a club called Silver Platter. And if you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend you to look at it. But because again, though an urban center, because it's not that. I feel like there's so much happening in New York itself. I a few years ago participated in a conference called Essentially Indigenous, organized by Mario Caro down at the old Customs building, the NMAI, and it was looking at bringing together a group of indigenous scholars and artists, thinking through how culture can actually work and activate their concerns. And it was very interesting for me because it was one of the most interesting conferences I'd been in a long time, because the urgency that exists within the communities that we're representing, they didn't have to debate it. You know, it was just like at their hand. It was part of their practice. They were doing the straddle that I'm talking about in an incredibly eloquent and interesting way. And what was interesting, though, for me, being part of I think at that conference, there was an extraordinary amount of extraordinary small amount of people in the room that were not indigenous. And again, that's for me something that was interesting to see how these shared interests exist, but they don't communicate because they're not recognized. And it's actually like both ends, both sides, both projections, which was something that was majorly discussed at that conference too. Who are we making work for? There's something. This universalness that sometimes comes very easily in an art environment, that it's just assumed that there is universal meaning or questions, and not that they don't exist, but I think they're not always there. That's kind of this unreflectedness of a certain kind of universalness that I struggle with. But then to resist sliding into what then is a kind of relativism where everything is particularized, right? Again, it's the tension. I feel like I'm opening up all these like spaces of tension that I'm interested in my practice to tackle and to work with.
I mean, a couple of sort of just fragmentary things. One I wanted to share with you something that I've also been sort of dealing with, a statement that I think might be sort of valuable. It's from a text written by Audre Lorde, in which she basically argues that poetry is not a luxury. And there's this observation that she makes that I've been thinking a great deal about in relation to the way in which the art world tends to sort of structure the propositions of change or transformation. So she writes, "There is no new ideas still waiting in the wings to save us women as humans. There are only old and forgotten ones, new combinations, extrapolations, and recognitions from within ourselves. We live in echoes." And I was reminded of this. I wanted to just sort of share a brief anecdote, if I can. And it's a response to your question, Nato, about spaces. And it's always difficult to do this because they immediately sort of emerges as a kind of romantic nostalgia. So it's difficult to figure out how to actually talk about these in any meaningful sense. But one of the most, so I think of the classroom as a teacher as one of these kinds of spaces, if one can claim this. And a question that I would have for all of us, but for David, is educational institutions that have long claimed this kind of humanistic value, that have stood, as you've sort of identified institutions as having, in a certain sense, a notion of a long-term investment, as carrying forward. There is a crisis that's happening around education at the institutional level, and then I think also at the level of its content and its meaning, that I think is worth us spending some time thinking about. But one of the recent most sort of instructive experiences that I've had was when I taught for a year at Ohio University, which is a small university. It's a state-funded university in the small and very sort of shabby town of Athens. And the name sort of in itself sort of opens up to the grand promise of what the education is, yet the sort of very sort of fabric in southern Ohio, in Appalachia. And I taught there at, in the first years of this most recent financial crisis. And the entire project of the curriculum was disrupted as student after student, in a sense, went into crisis. Their parents lost their jobs, homes were foreclosed on, parents would lose their cars and would not be able to commute to work. The sort of material impacts, and most of the students, 95% of the students at the university, so it's a very different demographic from the one that we're dealing with at the New School, for example, or at other educational institutions in this city, are from within Ohio. They're often the first in the family to come to college. Their desire is really organized around that notion of ascendancy into the middle class. And being in the midst of that crisis in that location, in that space, and watching that desire, that ideology of ascendancy through education collapse and crumble. And then having to figure out how we were going to learn and what we were going to learn in the face of that was extraordinary. One of the things that we did was go into these small former mining towns in Appalachia where they're depopulating, but people are beginning to form these very small historical societies. And what's going on there is a deep project of historiography, not just the archiving, but a question of what history actually is, what the old is, in that sort of sense that Audre Lorde, I think, invites us to think about it. What does it mean to actually go back to those places? You know, and these were the towns where the United Mine Workers Union, the conversations leading up to the formation of that, probably, if not the greatest, certainly one of the greatest interventions into the labor system that has ever occurred, arose from those small towns and the conditions of those small towns, and that there is a continuity, in a certain sense, in memory, that for us to go into those spaces, as opposed to thinking, as many of those students were, these were art students, that my future is in New York or Los Angeles, but that in fact the future was right there in that context, was a profound experience for me in this process of what it means to sort of build the long term.
May I quickly follow up on that?
No problem. And then from there, we're going to take questions from our awesome audience.
Well, Robert's comment is spot on and central in so many ways. He's telling that the story of Ohio U and the students and the communities is telling a complicated story about the way the crisis in higher education is cross-cutting the economic crisis, but also the very real democratic promise of those students having access to the university. But the last thing that's part of that story is the emergence over the last 20 years of very rich campus community practices in art and culture making, as well as lots of others, that make the classroom, the community, blur the boundaries between in here and out there in ways that are very rich for art making, which also has to overcome its own idea that there's a sacred in here in the object, like the college campus. And I think the moment that we're at is a moment in which are we going to find our way out of a path of educational crisis that builds on that kind of democratic pedagogy and democratic culture making, or are we going to find a different way out of it that is much more instrumental and damaging to both education and democratic culture making? I think we're at a crisis point within higher ed in just the way that story captures.
Can I?
Okay, you want to kick us off into the questions from the audience?
Maybe, yeah. I think what's interesting, what I was just thinking in terms of the urgency and what we started out, Nato, your question was, and what you two were just laying out. I think there's one thing about, and if we would have more time, I would actually love to talk about the role of pedagogy and education in dialogue with art practice, because I do think they're, again, two different things. And but one thing I sometimes think is, what we don't have enough is access to culture and art, and I think a lot of community projects offer that, actually. Like they offer exactly that space, because it is not necessarily teaching to engage in an art project in that linear sense of that pedagogy can be or is, but it opens up a space of reflection where I think also when we deal with historic moments, for me it's not so interesting to tell people the stories or tell people about the things that have been forgotten, but to kind of create conditions where they can recognize that the things that they thought are forgotten are just present, we're just not seeing them, right? It's this really, to go back to kind of an American indigenous understanding of history and time, where time is represented often, I mean, in the Southwest, as a spiral which constitutes the world in motion, meaning that not in opposition to a linear conception of time, where the idea of separating the past from the present is considered a very violent and gesture that is at the core of a lot of problems and a lot of, certainly at the basis of colonialism, that you separate the past from the present instead of recognizing that everything that has ever happened is actually here. It's right here. It's on the stage. It's in our lives. It's in this. It's certainly in this city and on this land. So, for me, art is a space where that possibility exists, to open up that space without having it be a directed space that needs to produce anything except a space of reflection for the community and listening and being present into these forces that insist in their presence. They're here. We just need to pay attention.
Okay, so we're going to switch to you guys. Anybody got questions? Peter, I knew you would have a question.
So I'd like to get to your point, Nato, about the summer coming up. And I'd like to just suggest maybe that the Vera List Center could think about having scientists with artists, because I think what's missing when we have, architects and artists and so on, my experience has been that time and again, when you try to address things like global warming, scientists resent the artist as incompetent or unqualified or not able. But of course, scientists themselves are stuck in their own institutional boxes and can't move. And sometimes they even get crushed when they really try to deal with it. So I think it's important that we have, pursuant to your point about the summer and the heat and the real, I'm starting to say urgent issue, to have some way of having art and science get together.
Well, just to say on that, it's funny because I was just talking with my good friend Trevor Paglin about, he's working with scientists on a very different project, but it's about building satellites that have no views. And he's been talking to people in the science, often a scientist, it's interesting because a lot of scientists go in with the same kind of values that artists go in, with these kind of useless dreams, utopian dreams, and then they end up often working for a defense industry. And they are eager to unlock the young dream in themselves. And I think that's an untapped creative world that I think there's a lot of possibilities for it. Certainly, when you start saying to scientists, hey, do you think of yourself as an artist? There's very few that don't say, yes, of course, I am an artist. But I think it's important too, and there is a crisis around the environment. I mean, that's the other thing, just to say, it's not like just also go to Andrea's point. The one thing that I want to say is it's not just my job at Creative Time, doing this kind of social justice art stuff for the Vera List centers. I'm not inventing that artists are doing this stuff, right? There is so much of this stuff popping up all over the place. You don't invent that. That's coming out of history right now. That is coming out of I think, some deep feelings, and I think a deep respect for what culture can do in interpersonal relationships and community. That is very interesting because it is in Ohio and it's all around the world. You see it, and it's certainly, we don't have the metrics, but I just wonder math-wise, if you could look at how many people kind of use this stuff today, the kind of combining culture and activism and civic relationships. I just think it's so much more robust now. It's just a language that is it's not just artists anymore. It's I don't know what you call it.
Just to answer that question, the Metropolitan Museum just had a collaboration with Bill McKibben and the artist DJ Spooky, which was really fascinating. And the Climate Institute now in New York is interested in an exhibit that I put together called Petroleum Paradox, which is 70 artists responding to petroleum dependency, and it's traveling through the country right now.
Thank you.
I also wanted to quickly add to that. I agree with Nato that this is untapped potential, but it's also at the same time a huge, huge area of investigation. There are art science centers at UCLA. There are initiatives around the world from artists in labs in Zurich. This weekend, actually, there is CEAT, that's also Science, Art and Technology, meeting with members of the NEH, of the NEA. So there are really huge programs around the world, also working on climate change and other things.
Thank you for that. That's very true.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about Occupy. You used the past tense when you referred to it. So Occupy started, of course, in the park, but this week I went to Occupy the Pipelines. We marched to the Waldorf. And debtfair.org is a new project that you should all check out on the web. Thanks.
Can you?
Debt strike.
Debt fair.
No, debt fair is different than debt
Fair is
strike.
different. What's the difference?
Debtfair.org.
Can you tell us what it is real briefly?
It's Occupy Museums has started it, and it's a new concept of selling art through artists talking about student debt and relieving debt instead of making a payment with cash. So it's exciting.
I mean, the Illuminator continues as well. Art and labor continues. So yes, it's by no means, yeah, Cooper Union.
Hello, my name is Andrea. I'm from Spain. I was part of the 15M movement 2 years ago, and I wanted to talk about the urgency that you were talking before. I feel that the 15M happened too soon, because right now Spain is worse than it was 2 years ago, and people either are too depressed to participate or outside the country, as I am. But some of the structures that were born 2 years ago are still working, and it was like when you upload a new program, a new version of a new program in your computer, something like that happened to the society, to all the youth in Spain, because we were the first generation in a democratic Spanish politic situation, and we thought that we believed in politics, and in politicians, and then we realized that things were not working that way. And so we changed our mind, and now we are more active, and I can feel that. The problem is that most of us need to go outside to find a job or whatever. And I also wanted to say something about education. When I always listen to you talking about education, you always talk about teaching, and I think it's not about teaching, it's about learning. And so it would be great to hear something a little bit more about pedagogy from you all, and how do you face pedagogy. But I really think that that's the difference, that we shouldn't be talking about teaching, we should be talking about learning. Thank you.
Do you guys want to respond to that? Any of the teacher learners?
I'll do it because I can sort of do it from young on up. I agree with you. I think it is about learning, and as a teacher, I mean, I struggle a lot with whether I was a teacher, an artist, and I just decided at one point I educated and made art whenever I taught or whenever I made art. But for me, it's the listening again to whoever my students are, and learning from them, and then helping them to do the things that they want to do, or the things that they're capable of doing that they might not understand, so that every time I do something, it becomes a different way of doing it. And then I also work with teachers and teach them or learn with them how to do similar things in their own classrooms.
I guess I would, if I may, I would tweak or push back on that a little bit. It seems to me teaching and learning are relationships that are happening all the time, and what I hear in your comment is a very excellent suspicion of not investing the teacher with kind of hierarchical expertise. I agree with that, but we want to have communities of teaching and learning in which we're not embarrassed about serving as teachers, including horizontally in those communities. There's a wonderful catchphrase in the academic civic engagement movement speaking about the kinds of partnerships that Robert was describing in Ohio, which is expertise on tap, not expertise on top. But what I like about it is we need that expertise of the person who has things to teach, but it needs to be fluidly shared and come from everywhere.
Can I ask a real quick question? It's a very dumb one. But why do schools cost so much?
David?
I'm just so confused. They cost so much money. Why did it cost so much more than they used to?
It's personnel, actually. Like all universities have started to like show their staff members their budgets. That's the new strategy, or show parts of the budgets. But in the town hall meetings that our provost and president hold, what we learn is that. No, I teach here at the new school. What we learn is that what costs is the personnel. It's healthcare, which is a crime, how much healthcare costs here. It's healthcare, it's all the social security, it's personnel. That's what is the majority, I think, of most university budgets.
And just those costs have been going up exponentially lately?
It's a really complicated 50-year story. In public universities, it's the defunding of public education from state universities. It's healthcare. It's the fact that higher education vastly expanded 50 years ago because of a democratic opening, and all the facilities have 50-year life cycles, so that's coming due. So to say that is not to say that it's sustainable. We have to find ways of completely changing the cost structure. But there's a kind of perfect storm of different factors that have produced this thing we're living through.
Well, and I think it's important just on the art activist front, because everyone I talk to lately, Occupy folks, everyone, when they look 10 years in the future and they say, where's the real movement in this country coming? They all say, it's a student movement, it's the crisis in education, it's all falling apart, and you're going to see it all come together in the next few years. That's what I hear from everybody.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, hi.
Okay.
I myself, I'm very concerned with the new school as a place that I'm beginning to feel is becoming more and more nightmarish, and has really losing any connection to the idea of a university in exile. I'm listening to you, and I'm going both ways. You know, first I was tremendously excited as people who one can come to and work with, to really look and undergo in many ways the suffering and misery of trying to understand what's happening to the dream of humanism in even its most advanced places, like in the new school. And then it's very tricky, because after a while I wonder whether you're not simply another functioning missionary group, calmly and very efficiently and very professionally operating out into the world, while inside everything is beginning to die. My own personal concern.
Do you have an opinion? I mean, can you weigh in on what do you think? Is that what's happening?
Well, I don't want to yes, absolutely, and I'm finding it out. I'm an adjunct here, and I was evaluated and very negatively in all this. But what strikes me is not that, and I don't want to get into too much of my personal story, but I began to see that no one really cared. And I began to see that if things happen here, like evaluation, and you try to talk to people as though this is a crisis, they get involved in the union and people grieving your problem and all the rest, and people don't seem to take seriously that if anything happens here that is unjust and counter to the norm of education and reason, that this is a very serious thing in the university. If the university had millions of dollars and can be world famous, yes, that's why I can't say too much about my own situation, because I'm already being told not to talk about it. But what I want to know is this. Are there people here who one can come to, let's say anyone in your group, who those of us who are suffering in this university can come to, not as some external group to from the outside come and try to do some kind of strategy, but people who are co-sufferers in a really serious way with the crisis that we're facing right now. I would like to talk to such people. I would like to know whether such people exist. I hope you're among those people. Thank you. I wouldn't talk anymore.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. We're going to take one more comment from in here, and then we'll... Oh, we got him. We got one thing. No, I think you've got the microphone. You get to go. That's just kind of the rules work.
My concern here, which I haven't heard anybody address, is the issue of anonymity and isolation. I don't know what most people think, but I am certain that most people are very scared today across social class lines. All the institutions, from the universities to the unions to every major institution you can identify, are looking for ways to preserve themselves in existence. They're not thinking about what people actually need. I ran a number of programs where I organized people who work as teams to achieve goals, small teams, 3 to 5 people. I took a stratified population of unemployed people, organized them into 3 to 5 person teams with a common business market focus, and led them through the process of analyzing that business market, looking for unserved or underserved needs for which they could position themselves. It was very successful. I organized students in a class, and I got a chance to teach an adjunct class, which I absolutely will never do again. I organized the teams, the kids in the class, to write a term paper as teams of 3. And they wrote higher quality papers than any of them could have done. They didn't know anything. Higher quality papers than they could have done by themselves. But working as a team, you can leverage abilities, the creativity, the interchange, the confidence of pursuing something that you wouldn't do by yourself, all those things. But for a team to work, a team has to bond. The people have to see their complementary abilities. They have to see the common expectations that each has. They have to see a connection among themselves. That's not happening among the organizing entities, whatever they may be. The war on poverty thing was successful to the extent that it actually employed people, poor people, who had no prospects of getting jobs otherwise. And people wanted jobs. They want money. It's just kind of simple, you know. But that's not happening today. The Occupied movement came up with a bunch of clever slogans, but it gave people no sense that their anonymity was being dealt with. People felt just as isolated and just
the
as
people
afraid
that were
before
in it, or the people looking at it?
as they did afterward.
The people looking at it, or the people in it?
The people they were trying to draw into the movement. And I haven't heard anything from any of you suggesting how people could be made to feel more relevant. You just want them to follow whatever the hell it is that you want to do, but you're not showing them what's in it for them. And I wish you would think about that.
Okay, does somebody want to respond to that?
Well,
we have to end really soon.
I do want to.
But it just feels weird to leave it at that.
Yes. No, I do actually want to disagree with you a little bit in terms of, or disagree. I don't know. I just want to say that I think it's. I think you're identifying a really great point around how the recent years have created an isolation and that this individualism, late capitalism and consumption has produced, and other systems, the universities. But one response to that I would like, if for some of you who have not read that yet, I think that the Cooper Union students' declaration of no confidence in their president is an incredible document where a community has come together over the last 3 years fighting the incorporation of their institution into the logical system of paid universities. I want to give them a great applause and shout out, because they are really actually doing what you're saying is not happening. So yay. And so I want to, for me, like when I hear that, I want to identify, yes, the individualism, you're right, we have to work against it, but we shouldn't like come and say, you're not doing that, we're not doing that. It is happening, and we choose to participate in that or not, and everybody has to put in, you're right, their effort to bring people together, to form communities, and also to organize David was talking about how these works that he does constitute communities, but also I think where the civil rights movement, feminism, ACT UP has taught us is that these ways of being political are only successful if we manage to actually organize across difference and not along the lines of sameness, right? Which is happening on the right now. This idea of like a presumed sameness set like that, and we're seeing where they're going with that, which is really destructive in many ways. But the real, I think, for me, places of getting somewhere is when we learn from these large movements and organize across difference and find larger constituencies that way.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, our panelists. Thanks, Carin. Thanks, Vera List Center. Thank you. We're going to take a break.
Can I, on a selfish kind of drive, can I invite you all tonight? The Parsons graduate students open their thesis show at the kitchen. And we're a new program that is very much in dialogue with the Vera List Center for Arts and Politics. So please come and see our shows, The Intelligence of Things, opening tonight at the kitchen. Thank you.